So I think that's a common trap, that there's an expectation assumed. If I have a boundary, then you need to respect it. Fundamentally, the boundary for me is for me to respect.
Hello and welcome to the Wellness Dojo podcast. Today we have Kaylie Rodriguez, a registered psychologist, and we're talking about boundaries. How do you recognize and set proper boundaries in your life to set you up for more success and happiness within your life? I hope you enjoy this episode as much as we did. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome to the Wellness Dojo podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Craig, and I'm so excited to have Kaylie Rodriguez with us here today. Kaylie is a registered psychologist. She has her own private practice, YYC Psychology. She specializes in addiction and mental health, is ART certified, clinically certified in hypnotherapy, and trained in neurofeedback technology. Kaylie, thanks so much for being here and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So before we get into our discussion today, can you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, how you got into psychology, and just a little bit about your journey?
Sure. How did I get into my journey? So I think I was a bit of an exception. Back in high school, I took psychology in high school, and I found that I actually quite enjoyed the classes, and I whipped right through them. I went to Bishop Carroll, so it was work at your own pace. And I whipped through both classes in probably about a week a piece. And I also found growing up as well, I tended to be the person that my friends would talk to. I liked listening. So I kind of had that part of my personality as well. So through school and university, I went into my undergrad and just started off with basic social sciences, assuming I'd go into psychology. And the path never strayed. So I stayed on that journey, and I graduated young. And, I was a go-getter in that sense of I want to, become self-reliant and get into my master's and all those types of things. So that was my education. And when I started working, I started working for an EAP industry. So like your 1-800 employee benefits type thing. And did a lot of general counseling, found myself actually started working in addiction at that point as well. So I was coordinating assessments across Canada for addiction and whatnot. So they were fitness to work assessments. So for people who had tested positive or came forward with a problem. So that was a real interesting part of my career, because I'd either have people who are really wanting help or people who are very resistant to help and kind of felt caught, for lack of a better term, at work. So we're there at the front end to keep their job. And I found through that process, actually, the people that really embraced the process, it was really just eye-opening and rewarding seeing the growth and change and transition within them. So I really enjoyed addiction, and I started acquiring some additional credentials in the area. In education, I find for a lot of fields, medical doctors as well, our exposure to addiction is quite limited. So a lot of that training comes, post schooling. And then from there, I was working for some private facilities, and I was consulting at a men's inpatient treatment. And then I found myself expanding our family. So for my first maternity leave, when it was time to go back to work, I didn't have a job at the time to go back to. And I had a lot of fear and worry of what am I going to do? And, the whole idea of boundaries, which is what we'll be talking about today, that's kind of bubbling in the background, meaning I wanted to have family balance and things like that, and found myself in my self-employment started then. So that's when YYC Psychology started in my private practice, and I haven't looked back since. So that was about 9 years ago now at this point. And so that's kind of my journey from a life perspective. And the last 9 years, we have 2 children now. And so there's been lots of fun and excitement along the way.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I love that you mentioned like how, with boundaries or with anything really, like we all have our own kind of experience with all of these different things. And I think sometimes people, either forget that or kind of overlook that when we're helping them with certain things. It's like, yeah, I'm also have my own struggles and my own, experiences that I've learned from. Do you take a lot of your kind of personal experience and try and like use that to help you navigate with clients as well?
hmm
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I find it makes it more relatable. So I will often share, personal stories and things like that, as a means of teaching or trying to reiterate a, point or something that I'm trying to connect with the client. So it's I think quite empowering, and I think it also puts you on two level playing fields almost, because I think oftentimes clients will assume that, as an example, I don't get stressed, or, everything is rainbows and butterflies, which isn't reality.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And I also really liked what you said about, there's a dynamic here too of people who want to be helped or who are ready and willing to be helped, and people who are resistant to that. And I think that ties very closely into this talk about boundaries as well, right? Of like good boundaries
Absolutely.
and bad boundaries and all of that type of thing. So I mean, let's get into that discussion. With boundaries, like, how do people first, from your experience, how do people recognize when boundaries need to be put into place?
Typically too late. So usually it's kind of a working backwards type of thing. So, when people are feeling overwhelmed or burnt out or frustrated or very hurt, or, lots of different big feelings is how I would describe it. So usually those feelings will be clues and information that something was lacking earlier. And oftentimes that comes back to boundaries.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I've had times in my life before where, you do kind of feel like it's too late. And then, but I mean, I found that even when you feel like it's maybe too late, like there's always time to start. Like you can always start like laying some foundation, laying the bricks and that type of thing. What are some of the most common things that you maybe see in your practice where people are coming to you and you're recognizing like there's been some boundaries that have been either not respected or boundaries that need to be put in place here?
hmm Yeah, I think your comment, boundaries not being respected, that within itself, I think is a common maybe roadblock or expectation around boundaries. So the idea is that if I have a boundary, you need to respect it. No, you don't. So my boundary is for me, and whether or not you respect it, that just gives me information. So as an example, if I express a boundary to you and you're willing to respect it, great. That shows me there's some capacity and connection, some healthiness to the dynamic. But if you're not willing to respect my boundary, that's also information for me. So that will show me maybe the reality of where that relationship is at and that dynamic is at. So I may need to have firmer boundaries. So I think that's a common trap, that there's an expectation assumed. If I have a boundary, then you need to respect it. Fundamentally, the boundary for me is for me to respect. And that's really the big highlight within that. And also it's quite empowering that, I can have a boundary and you don't need to respect it and I can still follow through with it. So an example I will often give clients is, an assumption is the boundary is you can't talk to me like that. You can't yell at me. And the boundary rather is expressing how I feel. I'm not comfortable with this. If you continue to yell at me, I'm just going to leave. So, if you'd like to continue, great, bring it down. But if you don't and you continue to yell, then I'm prepared to follow through with what my needs are. So that's a very different communication, but also a message for myself. I feel far more empowered versus fearful of what you're going to do or not do. I know what I'm willing to do for myself. So I just wanted to address that first point of your question. And then I think, boundaries come in all different sort of shapes and sizes and contexts as well. So from a burnout perspective, like we are a society of busyness and a society of overdoing it, achievement, things like that. So when we are constant go, 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 and we feel overwhelmed and things like that, there's a clue of boundaries that are definitely needed within that. So that's just one element. There's a lot of, personal boundaries around our own value system. So I mentioned just that idea of communication and what I'm willing to accept. And, somebody yelling at me, I'm not willing to accept that, and that's okay. So that's a personal boundary for me.
Yeah, you're so right when you mention about, a boundary is set for you and it's not necessarily set for other people. While we do set boundaries between us and other individuals, that's one thing that I've noticed in my life and that I've heard from people close to me or clients that I've worked with when they are attempting to set boundaries is it can really, you might have a friendship or a family member who you really do love and you really do respect them and you still want to have them in your life in some capacity, but there's things that are happening that you recognize for yourself. You just can't continue to live that way, or you just can't continue to let that line be crossed. And that's kind of what came to my mind when you mentioned that was, a boundary maybe not necessarily being like a brick wall as you would maybe vision it, but rather a line in the sand of saying like, I'm not shutting you out, but I'm telling you that if this line is crossed, that, I'm not going to continue to deal with it in the way that I had in the past. Is that, yeah.
Yeah, and that's just it is when we continue to deal with it the same way we have in past, we end up enabling dysfunction. So to your point too, is when I start to do different, I can see, what is the reality of this relationship as well. And boundaries are fluid. So it's not something that, to your point, has to be that brick wall and we cut someone completely out, but we may take time and space from people at times. So it may be more of a firm boundary in that regard, but it doesn't necessarily mean forever. So it's important to really take a look at yourself and again, what my needs are. So when I have a boundary with someone, as an example, and I decide to take space from them, it actually invites space for me to feel all those feelings that are connected to them in that relationship. So sometimes people are like, oh, I have this boundary. I don't have to deal with it anymore. I feel better. So that's more of like relief and avoidance. So what will happen is we need to really take a look at then the feelings that are connected to that individual, because what will happen is next time we run into them, there's going to be a panic. There's going to be a big uproar of feelings that come, and we feel really flustered and overwhelmed. So all of those feelings that are attached to that person are still there. So that's more avoidance as a clue. Whereas when we actually look at boundaries and we have that space to process all of those feelings there, we don't have such a reaction to when we see that person. So we feel far more grounded and connected within ourselves. It doesn't mean we're maybe perhaps still a little bit uncomfortable, because that may give us information that that person isn't safe for me. But at the end of the day, it's not so debilitating, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And, there's this concept of, as we're talking about, there's two different types of boundaries, really. The way that I look at it is like you're setting boundaries either for yourself or boundaries for relationships in your life. And we're kind of talking right now more about relationships. And, I've often looked at like, in the past, I've said like that person's toxic or like toxic people. And I've really adjusted that through my life to think like, I don't think that person's necessarily toxic. It just might be a toxic relationship for me at this time in my life. And that's where it really resonates when you say information, like setting a boundary or testing a boundary. It gives you an opportunity to gather information. How do they respond to this boundary? Do they make it all about them, or are they concerned about you? And like those types of things really do tell you more about those people and maybe why you are feeling the need for that boundary.
And that's a key point, is to gather information. So the word I use is be curious, rather than, okay, if I say no, then they're going to say, okay. And that like, there's the whole story behind it. But if I can just be curious and say, okay, what's going to, like, let's see what happens. How does it feel for me? So that's the be curious approach will allow you then to reflect on what's going on for you, because regardless of if your boundary, like boundaries are always internal, meaning they're for you. Sometimes we express them. We don't always have to express them. But we come back to ourselves and look at what we need and how we feel within there. So, when we have our boundaries, it's important for ourselves to honor them and reflect upon them and just be curious about what information comes up. So, I think they are ever, there's ebbs and flows to them, and they do shift over time. And when you are less attached to the other person, as an example, then you can be curious and just see what happens. But as soon as we have that strong attachment, then generally, typically what happens is we have an expectation around what will happen and that story that will follow from there. So I think, the other comment I wanted to make when it comes to boundaries, as an example, that idea of being the yes person. If you always say yes and you start to say no, and that becomes a boundary for you, people are not going to like that to begin with, because they have an expectation of you and how you're going to respond. So you will ruffle some feathers. And then what will happen is sometimes people feel, well, boundaries don't work because they're upset with me. And that's, again, a trap, where the boundary comes back to you and what you need to do for yourself and how you feel and all of those types of things. Other people's responses is not an indicator of whether or not they work.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that's a big thing that oftentimes stops people from trying to set a boundary, is this fear or this worry around feeling guilty or feeling like, oh, it's going to change the relationship and there's really good aspects of that relationship, or I don't want to lose this relationship completely. And sometimes people feel guilty. They feel like they're being a bad person. Like, oh, me saying no to this person, all of a sudden they're going to think I hate them, or they're going to think I'm mean, or whatever the case might be. Right. So how do people start to overcome that fear, that worry, and that guilt when setting a boundary?
Yeah, through action. So it's through practice. So what will happen is there may be sometimes some people may reinforce that, oh, you're not being nice because you're not saying yes, and things like that. But again, those are those dynamics and those relationships that are expecting you and not really honoring your feelings in there. So that's good information within itself. So the more that you practice, the more that you talk and share about it as well. With a psychologist or a supportive friend or somebody like that, is just to have people that you can share how you're feeling, not to kind of co-sign all of that. Yeah, they're not very nice because they're this, they're that. It's not about them. It comes back to yourself, right? So we want to come back to taking a look at how these boundaries feel for you. And if I feel guilty, that's just information, again, within me, that I've got a belief system that I'm bad if I'm not always saying yes. So as we continue to practice and work through it, we build our relationship with ourselves. We move through those feelings, and then we see the value of putting our relationship with ourselves first. So I think there's a fallacy or belief system that having boundaries implies that you're unkind or that you're selfish or things like that. All that a boundary does is it invites you into the equation. So as an example, like, I like to help people, but if I'm constantly outpouring and not inpouring, it's at a cost to myself, and then I'm no use for anybody, including myself. So there are times where I may say yes, where it's something that I would like to do for myself and show up and be that kind, caring friend. And there are other times I may have to say no, and that's okay. And it's those friendships that will grow within those boundaries on both sides. So if a friend has a boundary for me, how does that feel? So being on the other side of it can bring up a lot of feelings as well. So it's just that, again, constant reflection and ebb and flow of those feelings and allowing them to move through. But to essentially go through guilt and all those feelings, I'd say that's a common reaction, but it's through practice.
Yeah. And is there strength in just accepting the fact that, like, everybody is allowed to, deal with that boundary in their own way, and that doesn't necessarily make this person bad or this person mean or them a bad friend or anything, but they're going to deal with it in their own way, and just being okay with that and walking away and saying, I did what I needed to do for me, and they're going to deal with it however they need to deal with it, and then we'll just see where it goes. Like, is there a strength to that? Is that something that you tell people to try and do, or how do you guide people through that situation when they're really resistant to it, or they've said it, and now, now having that boundary actually has created some anxiety and stressful feelings.
Yeah. And again, it goes back to the stories our brains will tell us. So fundamentally, those foundations of our belief systems is what I would encourage people to explore. So there's a belief system. What I'm hearing in your example is that if I have a boundary or if I say no, then it implies that I'm not a good friend, or, there's a judgment behind that. So I'd encourage people to take a look at their own belief systems. So what happens if someone, says no to them? What do? And usually people say, okay, that's fine. But there's an expectation of self that's very different. So from there, it goes into practicing those boundaries, which in turn will create more balance in our lives. So there's a whole sort of shift in realm within that. We look at our beliefs, we look at our boundaries, which will then create more balance. And there will be people, again, that are resistant or reactive to those boundaries, but that's information about them. So with clients, I try and bring their attention back to themselves. Like, how is this serving you? So if you're the person that always says yes, and you're resistant to saying no, how does it serve you in saying yes? What's your motivation in always saying yes? Oftentimes it goes back to fear and shame. Will people like me? If I say no, what will they think? So that's the stuff that I would encourage people to process for themselves. It's not about the other person and what they do or don't do, but more so, what's my internal story and what feelings are coming up within me.
Yeah, I think that's such an empowering thing for people to do too. Like, whether you're always saying yes or always saying no, like just being willing to try to change things a little bit when things aren't going the way that you want them to go. Like, usually if somebody's talking about this or it comes up, it's because there's something going on that they're, not feeling good about. And so, yeah, just like, is that something you tell people, like, test the waters first, or how do you help people to approach that conversation if it's a conversation with another person of, this is a firm line that I'm drawing in the sand, or this is a firm boundary that I need to set for myself? How do people approach that conversation? Because I know there's probably listeners right now who are thinking like, yes, there's definitely things in my life that I need to be changing, or firmer boundaries that I need to be setting with, either relationships or within myself, but it's hard, right? And obviously it's hard, and like you said, it comes with action. But if it's with another person, for example, your spouse or maybe a close friend, how do people start that conversation with somebody else in a way that, we've talked about, like, not focusing too much on the other person, focusing more on yourself, but at the same time, you don't want to go into it and actually hurt somebody's feelings with that boundary? How do people approach that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot in your example that you're talking about, and even that idea of hurting someone's feelings. So, just a comment to that is like, I could be kind and respectful and somebody's feelings could still be hurt. So I'm not responsible for other people's feelings, nor am I powerful enough to make them feel. So it's a really hard concept for people to really wrap their minds around. Just as you can't make me feel things, you can trigger stuff that's within me, but you can't make me feel. So if people are open to really reflecting upon that and exploring that, now that doesn't give me permission to go around and just, be a jerk in my communication and all sorts of things. So I need to really come back to a space that, I try to be kind, I try to be respectful in my communication, but I can't control what other people hear, and I can't control how other people feel. So giving yourself permission to just, again, have space in that is, I think, really important. But I think to your comment, like, how do you go about communicating boundaries and all of that? Sometimes they don't have to be communicated. Sometimes they can be just an internal, element for yourself, a boundary for yourself. So as an example, if you're gossiping about somebody and something like that, and I'm not comfortable with that, I may voice, I'm uncomfortable with you talking about this. Can we shift the conversation? Alternatively, I may try and change the conversation, or I may just leave the conversation and exit and say, I got to run or whatever. It doesn't necessarily mean it's avoidance. Avoidance is very different than having a conscious boundary that you're connected with. They can look the same on the outside, but the motivation behind is very different. So, if there's a group of people and they're gossiping, I won't go up to them and say, hey, don't talk about this. I'm not comfortable with it. But I more excuse myself and I just remove myself from that group. So that's one element. But with those closer relationships, this is where I encourage potential communication. So as an example, I may express, this is how I'm feeling. How are you feeling? So it's not a conversation about this is how I feel, therefore you shouldn't, should, or should not. It's more about staying on your side of the street, having the conversation about how you're feeling, and in turn inviting the other person in to express how they're feeling. How do you feel? It's a very different conversation than the shoulds, because as soon as we get into the shoulds of what the other person should do, it becomes hot potato. Typically, they'll get defensive, they'll throw it back to you. There's a lot of blame and projection going back and forth between the two. So feelings is where I would encourage the conversation to start. But in order to do that, we need to really have clarity within ourselves first. So a lot of self-reflection, talking again to a psychologist or whatever that is, counselor, having some opportunity to self-reflect. Of course, we may need to have firm boundaries to begin with. If we're in an unsafe situation, we may need to just exit and give ourselves space, of course, to keep ourselves safe.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like self-awareness and ownership, right?
Yes.
When you're looking at these situations and you're deciding whether or not you should be placing a boundary, or do I need to voice something here? It really does come down to just being self-aware about how you're feeling, and then taking ownership to protect your feelings. And protect might be maybe the wrong word, but I guess maybe nourish your feelings, or just surround yourself with things that make you feel better. And I think, at least from my personal experience, that when I can take full ownership of like knowing that this is the right thing for me, and potentially even the right thing for this person or these people, this group, whatever, it makes it so much easier to voice that concern without all those, the worry, the fear, the doubt, the guilt, and that type of thing. Because you just walk into it with, I need this, and I know this is the right thing now. And to like credit to what you said, talking somebody through sometimes can really help with that too. Just having outside perspective to say, like, ask you questions and challenge that belief that you maybe have had, right? That's huge in that process, I think.
Absolutely. And I think, that loaded question of who am I, right? That will give you clarity too around what your boundaries are, because boundaries are just really, like a set of, and I say rules loosely, but it's like kind of an outline of what you're willing to accept and not accept. So if people are behaving outside of those rules or guidelines, then it's not going to feel congruent with yourself. So another word I would use is values. So if I'm connected to my core values of who I am and, what I value, so things like, say, honesty, truthfulness, respect, vulnerability, things like that, if people don't mirror the same thing, then it doesn't feel like it feels like you're kind of, hitting up against each other. It doesn't have that authentic feel to it. So that's just, again, internal boundary that, okay, this might not be the relationship that I'm going to try and really pursue this friendship and get to know this person, because their capacity isn't there. And that's a word you used in a different context earlier already, but capacity is a big thing. The other person may not have capacity of their own self-awareness. So it's going to be quite limited in how much you can truly authentically connect with each other. So it's just, again, observing and seeing what comes up for oneself. So when I have clarity on me and how I feel and my values, it becomes, I guess, clearer on what my needs are, and in turn, what my boundaries are.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because anytime in the past when I've thought about like the word boundaries, I always think of like a wall, right? And a wall is an external thing. Whereas the more you discuss boundaries, the more you practice boundaries, you really realize it's not a wall. It's more like an internal shield or something. and it is movable, and it is, you can put it up and take it down and stuff like that. And it really is a form of self-care. Like, I think if people can change their mind a little bit about it being this divide versus it's just a form of self-care, right? And
100%.
self-reflection.
Yeah, 100%. And that will be language I actually reflect to people. Like, another common one is people say, I need to put my boundaries up. And it's like that, I'm going to push it back. And to your point is it is an element of self-care. So my boundaries are not going to be different in my personal life, professional life. Like, fundamentally, the foundation behind them is all very similar, because I am me regardless in what sort of environment I'm in. So again, coming back to that idea of clarity, if I have clarity over myself and my values, those things are consistent no matter where I show up. So my boundaries will be relatively the same. They might be a little bit different in the sense of, like, work boundaries and time and stuff like that. But foundationally, the concepts beneath them and what drives them will be very similar.
Yeah. I'm curious what you believe makes some people better at this. Better at it is, again, it's not the right really phrase, but some people more comfortable maybe with this self-exploration and setting boundaries and just that self-reflection. I mean, I think I have an answer of like why some people might be a little bit better at setting boundaries and doing those things in their life, but I'm curious to hear what you think as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I, to your point about better and things like that, to me, it always comes back to openness and willingness. So it's not that it's comfortable for everybody. It is a practice. So we all have vulnerabilities in different ways and, different triggers in that regard. So if we always can come back to having some openness and willingness, that takes us into a try different mentality. A lot of times people want to say, try harder. Don't try harder, try different. So if we can try a little bit different, and maybe that means that, okay, I'm going to say no this time if it's something that I'm not really invested in. But hey, if I find that I say yes, and then I can change my mind too. So I can go back and say, actually, no, I can't do that. So, there is some flexibility within that. But another element that I would comment to is people pleasing. So people pleasing in again, relationship element is there's a big vulnerability there to really struggle to put oneself first. And I think that's common for many people in general, right? So that idea of being better at it may be just that we're seeing them at a different point in their journey as well. But when I say people pleaser, what that means is we want the approval of other people. We want other people's validation. On the flip side, we're fearful of their disapproval. So, and that stuff can come from childhood as well, like looking to the approval of our parents or overachievement and, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of different factors for things like that. But I think openness and willingness would be the biggest thing of where you may say someone is quote unquote better. There's just more action that's potentially behind it. But I wouldn't necessarily put it as like on a scale of better than or less than. We're just at different points.
Yeah. And like, I think the word better maybe comes from like this idea of it being like a skill. Yeah. Right. And it probably is a skill, but it's a skill that, like you said, I did martial arts all through my life, and there was always people that were better than me. There was always people that, were like, quote unquote, worse than me as well. But we were just at different stages, and we had just put in different amounts of practice and that type of thing. And it's really no different when you look at self-care, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think too, sometimes there's an expectation, like, so those people that look like they're, better at this skill, that they're void of the uncomfortable feelings because they're doing it. So we judge our insides to how other people look on the outside. Whereas that person who's, implementing that boundary, they may feel really nervous and, have that guilt and all those other feelings underneath the surface. We just don't see it. Yeah. So again, there's a lot of mask wearing that's apparent as well.
Is there a big part of this that comes down to just like obviously self-exploration, but to a deeper level of like really living with a purpose and living with your why. Like, why am I doing what I'm doing? Why am I in this relationship? What am I trying to achieve out of this life? And I feel like people who are living more aligned to their purpose or whatever they're hoping to achieve out of life have maybe an easier time practicing that, of like, because they have something to anchor them back to, like that idea. Like, I think a lot of people know that there needs to be change in their life, but they just don't know what they need to change. And like we've said a number of times, like talking to somebody is a really big tool that you can use for that. But through that, I think people who are really can identify with a purpose and a why in different situations maybe have a better time with that, or an easier time with that. Or
Yeah, and I hear what you're saying, and I think just a bit of a different language than I have with you, and that's totally okay. What I would say is more, again, going back to values. So that purpose, like to me, I always say, like, purpose lies within. It's not about that external, I need to achieve here or get there. I mean, that can be part of the process, but fundamentally it comes back to within, our purpose within ourselves, which is our value system. And awareness is key, right? So we need to have some awareness. And even if that awareness is something just doesn't feel right, or I feel like I'm missing something, or I really don't even know who I am, like that's a common one. And, when we start this process of exploration, again, is there some willingness? So if I have this willingness, it does sort of reveal as well belief systems. And a lot of our belief systems that we are attached to aren't our own. So they may be belief systems we've acquired through our upbringing, through society, through our parents, and we assume these belief systems that aren't our belief systems. So then there might be a revamping of some belief systems, which in turn leads to more compassion. But belief systems also go to boundaries. Awareness can lead to action. So I know I'm saying a bunch of different words here. And what's coming to my mind actually is a 3x3 matrix that I talk about in my work as well. And there's another office I contract to, Health Upwardly Mobile, and we have created this 3x3 matrix. We've written a book on it. It's coming out shortly, but it really explains all of these different paths to get to the place of contentment. And contentment isn't a destination, it's fluid. And the quickest path to it is through boundaries. So we have awareness, we implement boundaries, whether they're internal, whether we express them, and then we can come to that place of contentment. But it is a fluid process. And I think additionally, it goes back to being aware of who we are. When we have that awareness, we can then have congruence in our life, meaning our insides match our outsides, our insides of how we feel, how we show up, and who we surround ourselves with as well. So to your comment about that why or that purpose, that's where I'd say the parallels are there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I really enjoyed what you just said about the fluidness too, because I think people also, with that willingness, there needs to be a willingness to accept that it's going to change. You might figure out who you are this week. And then next week you're like, man, that thing I liked last week, like, I don't really like it anymore. It's like, you're going to continue to change, and things are always going to be evolving within yourself. And it's that, again, self-awareness, that willingness to continue to look within yourself and ask yourself the sometimes difficult questions, right?
Mm-hmm. And just because something may not go as planned, because that was something that was stated earlier, doesn't mean it's a bad thing. Yeah. And I will say to people, just because it feels bad doesn't mean it is bad. And just because it feels good doesn't mean it is good either. So our feelings give us information. And that is one of the biggest things that I try and teach and really create awareness with my clients, is to explore feelings, because the feelings provide you with that feedback and that information. So growth isn't about coming to a place, again, of rainbows and butterflies, so to speak, but it's being able to observe the uncomfortable feelings and take that information for what it is. It's not the absence of uncomfortable feelings, because those feelings are helpful and they're important to be aware of as well. So oftentimes people will measure and say, well, if I'm doing good, then I'll feel good. And, albeit there may be some moments of, that gratitude and groundedness and contentment and all those types of things. we might get, fear popping up or a bit of shame over here. And they're just growth opportunities. There's things for us to learn from those moments.
Yeah. Yeah. And one more thing that kind of relates to this that I wanted to ask you about is when we have set boundaries in our life, and maybe we've set them from like years and years ago. I know sometimes people have realized through conversations that they're like, oh, I had this boundary set up in my life, but maybe it's not serving me anymore. Like maybe it's actually getting in the way of some opportunities or some things. How do people recognize that?
Again, through their feelings, right? Through feelings and reflection. So if we even look at that from a relationship standpoint, so there's maybe a person you've, taken space from, or social media for that matter. Sometimes people will take a break and have a firm boundary with social media. So from there, it's like, can I be curious? So if I open this boundary up a little bit, what information do I get? So, this boundary that I'm stepping, like I'm opening it up a little bit and seeing, so I'm having contact or I'm using social media again. I'm more cognizant of what comes up for me. So why am I on social media, or how much time am I spending on that? Or what's my motivation for checking? Like there's just more of an inquisitive approach behind it. So we observe rather than being attached to, again, the storyline and that outcome. So it's very different. So when you start to explore shifting boundaries, first of all, maybe check it out with someone first. Yeah, I'm contemplating this, and get clarity on your motivation, because vulnerability is, like I said, we are attached to a certain story in there. But then just be curious, see what happens, self-reflect, talk about it. So you'll have information whether that boundary can, continue to loosen, or does it need to firm back up? And there is no right or wrong. And to your comment about we're always evolving, that is true. It's true of ourselves and it's true of other people. So boundaries are fluid. They aren't a rigid experience. And you don't have to decide them forever. It's just for now. So what's the boundary that you need for now?
Yeah, I think that is really big for people who are looking to set new boundaries in their life, is knowing that boundaries aren't permanent. It's a test. You're checking to see, like, does this boundary help me feel better in my life? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And the big theme that I'm picking up on is like willingness and feelings, right? Just that willingness to look at yourself, explore your feelings, whether it's painful or whether it's exciting, whatever it might be for you. Really just have the willingness to look within. And if that's difficult for you, then you get somebody external, get some external counsel. And whether that means starting with a friend, or whether that means starting with somebody you've never met before, and you hire somebody to come in and help you, like a psychologist.
Mm-hmm.
Get that help and do that exploration, because there's so many people that are just stuck, right? And they're
Mm-hmm.
frustrated because they're stuck,
Right.
but they're not willing yet to take those steps and to start to just really explore that, because it is hard.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think if we actually take a look at our lives, we can see that we have boundaries all around us, and within us, for that matter, that we are implementing on our day-to-day. Boundaries around bedtime, boundaries around hygiene, boundaries around clothing. There's so many different kinds of boundaries that we are implementing for ourselves, but we don't necessarily see it that way. So boundaries are, again, things for ourselves that we need. So I will have a rough boundary of bedtime as an example of when I'd like to get to bed. There will be boundaries that I try and have with my children around their own structure and routine. So things like routine are boundaries. So if we can take a look within our lives and reflect on that, part of the process is recognizing you're already doing it. So, and it may have seemed harder on the front end, and reminding yourselves, hey, I did this thing and now it seems more second nature to me. So anything like that is a boundary too. It's boundaries when we get caught up with other people become especially hard, because we have an emotional attachment, and then there's fear that gets caught up and all these other feelings as well.
Yeah. Yeah, like a good example that just popped in my mind is self-talk. And I've often used the example when talking with my clients with self-talk of, you know, would you ever, like, when you think about like things that you maybe say to yourself, like you joke around and say like, I'm so stupid, or I'm so fat, or these types of things,
Mhm.
like if somebody else said that to you, if one of your friends came to you and said like, you're so stupid or you're so fat, would you allow that to continue? Probably not. You'd probably be like, this person is just mean. Like, I'm not going to be around this person anymore.
Right,
It's like, why do we let ourselves get away with it all the time?
right.
Right? Why are we not holding ourselves to that same accountability, that same standard? And
Yeah.
I think that relates here a lot of like when you're looking at your boundaries that you've set for yourself versus boundary, it's easy to see boundaries that aren't, maybe easier to see boundaries with other relationships. Somebody's not treating you well. Well, there's a firm boundary there that clearly needs to be set up. But when you're looking within yourself, it becomes
Hmm.
a little bit more murky, and we don't really want to accept sometimes that we're being mean to ourselves or that we're not respecting ourselves in the way that we should be or that we want to be, right? That's
Hmm.
difficult.
And that's a great example of an internal boundary.
Hmm.
So, and as I mentioned earlier, boundaries are internal, but we can have boundaries with ourselves as well. So again, it's not about a pass fail or success fail in that regard. It can be an element of when I catch myself thinking that way, because it can be a reflexive response of our brain. It's like, how do I invite my own voice in there versus that negative self-talk voice? So my own self-talk may be something more compassionate. I'm learning, I'm in the process, or whatever, something more like a gentler approach that applies to oneself. So the boundary can be an element of if and when I catch myself thinking that way, I'm going to try and act in this way. And that can be, again, through even just like a sticky note on the mirror, just a reminder as well of that language, so we can start practicing it. Again, an internal boundary, maybe I'm practicing affirmations as well. There are a lot of different ways, like internal boundaries, about how much headspace something takes up within our mind. So I can try and practice that when I catch that hamster on the wheel, I'm going to try and try different, invite some meditation in. It's not as simple as just don't do it, right? Try harder, just don't do it. Doesn't work like that. Can I try something different when that voice is chirping in the background?
Yeah, I love that. That's definitely going to stick with me. Try different, not don't try harder, try different. I love it.
Yeah.
I hope that people will walk away with this conversation with a slightly different view on like what boundaries are. Like we mentioned, like that common vision of like it being a wall or a barrier versus it being fluid, like what it really is, right? And constantly changing and having full control over that boundary at all times and being, able to put a boundary up or, for lack of a better term, and
Yeah.
or to pull it down or and move it away and to use it as a test. I really hope that's how people walk away from this conversation with just a little bit of a different view on what that might mean for them in their life. Is there anything that we haven't touched on around boundaries that you wanted to touch on?
Mhm. I think just a message I would leave people with is just be gentle with ourselves. Because
Mhm.
going back to what I said, is feelings give you information. So when something feels bad, so to speak, it's just giving you information. So that awareness alone is a good thing, that perhaps I need a boundary here. So it's looking back fundamentally as boundaries. What do I need? What do I need? What do I value? And that's really the foundation of it. So when I'm feeling overstretched and overwhelmed, it's just telling me, okay, I need to have boundaries. I need to pull back a little bit. So that's not a judgment that I failed or I didn't do something right. And that's the trap people will get into, rather than being open and accepting that, hey, I feel uncomfortable or I'm feeling overwhelmed. Great. It's telling me that I need something. So here's the action that I can implement for myself. That's the compassionate piece. It's not a judgment that, oh, if I'm feeling overwhelmed, I've done something wrong or bad. The awareness is key. And that's the element that is really apparent in self-growth, is we have more awareness. It's not that absence of uncomfortable feelings, it's the awareness. And I think that's a really important message for people to take away. It doesn't imply a success, fail, good, bad. It's just exploring and staying in the process. So be gentle with yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, and get help if you need to, right? It's, people think that they should just be good at this already. Well, no, it takes practice, and sometimes it takes a little bit of nudging and guidance, right?
Totally. Yeah.
So where can people find you if they want to reach out, if they want to seek some help, seek some guidance, or if they even just want to find you on your social medias? Where's all the places people can find you?
Sure. So I have my website, YYCPsychology.com. So all of the contact information's there. My handles to my social media are there as well. Instagram, I'm at YYC Psychology. Same with Facebook as well. So if you search me up there, those are the two sort of major social media platforms that I'm engaged with. But yeah, and then if people who are listening have any questions or topics they'd like to hear about or things like that, I'm very open to, meeting people's needs in that regard. And all of my social media elements are just, different quotes and themes that come up in session and things like that. So they're not meant as a substitute to any sort of counseling or anything like that. And same with today's talk, but just more of information gathering and things like that.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on the show. And I think there's some really valuable information and discussion just around this topic of boundaries. And like I said, I hope people walk away with maybe a little bit of a different view on what that actually means to them.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. For additional support or to work with one of us one-on-one, go to our website, www.wellnessdojo.ca. You can also find us on Instagram at Wellness Dojo YYC or on all other social media platforms searching The Wellness Dojo. We'll see you in the next episode.